Today's anarchism differs in some ways from so-called classical anarchism of the late 19th and early 20th century, but I think less so than some people take it for. Today's anarchist movement is much more aware of forms of oppression that extend beyond just capitalism and the state. Racial oppression, gender oppression, and so forth. And the idea that the personal is political occupies a main part, but that's not actually that new to the anarchist movement. These same concerns, you can find in the 1880s, 1890s, 1910s, and you have Italian anarchist newspapers discussing these issues, Yiddish anarchist newspapers discussing these issues, as well as English language papers in the United States, discussing these issues, even making arguments in the early 20th century, basically arguing that race is a social construction, that gender roles are a social construction, which should not dictate how people behave or are treated. But that's certainly much more entrenched and systematic and front and center in today's anarchism. Today's anarchists are also, for whatever reason, tend to be younger, tend to come into anarchism not through working class organizations and struggles, but often through countercultural struggles, or not countercultural movements, who become interested through other avenues. It's less in the United States, it's certainly less of a movement of immigrants, which is both positive and negative. It's in the sense of the main body of people who make up the movement in the United States, I guess you could say, are more mainstream in the sense that they're not coming from marginalized immigrant groups, and therefore, their parents are, or their family members are part of the sort of mainstream America, and in that sense, they are not marginal. But at the same time, the earlier immigrant anarchist movement could, at certain times and places, could take deeper root, specifically because it was an immigrant movement. It could take a root in ethnic enclaves in places like the Lower East Side of New York, or the Italian community in New Jersey, which it's harder for anarchism today to do. You're not going to create a widely influential anarchist counterculture in suburbia. It's much more difficult. Whereas in the Lower East Side of New York, at the turn of the century, anarchism and anarchists, anarchist publications, anarchist poetry, anarchist theater, was part and parcel of mainstream Yiddish culture in the United States. Everyone knew who the anarchists were. A lot of people who weren't anarchists read the Yiddish anarchist newspapers. The most prominent early Yiddish poets were anarchists, writing on anarchist themes, and working class themes which resonated broadly with the working class immigrant audience. Today, although there are anarchist countercultures, I think in some ways those are more marginal in vis-a-vis mainstream American society than immigrant anarchism often was within immigrant society.